High on the Colorado Plateau, in the Four Corners area of Colorado, New Mexico, Utah, and Arizona, in a land characterized by snow-capped mountain peaks, semi-arid plateaus, and red rock canyons, there lived a prehistoric people. For more than 1,000 years, they flourished in this vast area drained by the River San Juan. Present-day Indians called these people the Anasazi. Archaeologists call them the San Juan Anasazi. Dr. Robert Lister, Dean of Present-Day Archaeologists, has excavated, directed research operations, and written extensively about this ancient culture. Listen to this Mesa Verde scholar as he interprets one of America's ancient jewels.
To me, this pot tells me much more than simply what an archaeologist would observe from such a vessel. This is the sort of pot, a bowl, that would have been made by a potter living in Spruce Tree House, that cliff dwelling in Mesa Verde. To an archaeologist who would dig up a pot like this, associated with other kinds of artifacts, he would call it Mesa Verde black and white. And to him, it would be a hallmark of the 1200s, because we have studied this pottery enough to know that it was made between 12 and 1300. So it becomes just like a fossil. It can tell you when found, when the people lived in a certain place, and we can trace the distribution of the culture of these people by following the finds of pots like this one. It's a product of a person's mind and a person's hands. A lady's hands, the potter. And that she didn't simply make something of her own volition. She was following cultural norms. She was making something that's rather a standard size. She was making it in a standard form. She was using certain design elements, combined different ways, to paint a design on this pottery. But her whole actions here are conditioned by the culture in which she grew up. She learned from her mother how to make a pot, how to decorate it, and that tradition, a conservative way of life, was perpetuated by the people who lived here in the Mesa Verde. Something else comes to mind here. This is not simply a utilitarian vessel. It goes well beyond that. It's well executed. It is beautifully decorated. It shows that the people of Mesa Verde and Anasazi in general took great pride in what they were doing. They didn't have to decorate this. They didn't have to make this as symmetrical as it was in order to function as a cooking pot or an eating vessel. But they did. And to me, this tells me that these people not only were craftsmen, they were artists. Who are these people who made such beautiful black and white pottery and who lived in the cliff dwellings? The story begins a long distance from here. It's a long one, but let's start in the beginning and I'll try to simplify the story for you. Man did not originate here in the New World. He developed to his modern status in Africa and Asia, and only after he became a modern man did he migrate from the old world to the new. That's an event that took place toward the end of the Pleistocene period, the Ice Age. And probably man began to trickle across the Bering Straits between Asia and what is now Alaska, at least as early as 12,000 years ago, 10,000 BC, if not earlier. And at that time, man was a nomad, an individual who made his living off of the large game that lived in Asia and migrated across that same land bridge, the Bering Straits, and down into North America. And the animals that man was preying upon were those that became extinct at the end of the Ice Age. Such things as the mammoth, an elephant-like animal, the camel, the horse, and a large bison. This period, archaeologically speaking, is called the Paleo-Indian period, or the big game hunting period, and lasted during the latter stages of the Ice Age until around 7,000 BC, when the ice disappeared, the glaciers retreated, and modern environment began to come into the picture, and with that the modern flora and fauna that we see today. When this occurred, the large mammals disappeared, and man, being an adaptable animal, had to change his whole way of life. No longer did he have all this flesh running around on 4 feet that he could kill with a spear. Instead, he had small game, like the deer and the antelope and animals that we find on the plains today. The big buffalo were gone, some small buffalo remained. So man changes his habit from being a hunter to being a forager, and hunting small game, gathering all kind of wild plant products. But he remains a nomad, or at least a semi-nomadic individual, following a seasonal cycle. This big revolution that took place in New World culture was triggered by events that took place in central Mexico, in southern Mexico, down in the state of Oaxaca, where man began to experiment several millennia BC with grasses, wild grasses, that he purposely gathered and planted from time to time and improved their strain until eventually he came up with a very primitive type of corn. Once this corn was developed to the point where it was an important edible crop, it gradually diffused from southern central Mexico up through the Valley of Mexico and up the Sierra Madres of western Mexico into the American Southwest. And it was taken over by those archaic foragers and gradually brought about sedentary, settled life. And that's the big revolution. Man changed from a nomad to a settled farmer. At that point, we developed 3 major cultural traditions in the Southwest, as we have defined them archaeologically. These 3 separate complexes of culture probably were conditioned by the different environments of the Southwest. The Southwest is quite a diverse region. And we have 3 of these major cultures named: the Mogollon, which exists down in the south part of New Mexico and the southeastern part of Arizona, and extends down to Mexico away. We have the Hohokam culture, occupying the desert of southern Arizona. And then up here where we are, up on the plateau, we have the Anasazi. These 3 cultures evolved more or less simultaneously. So we pick up culture several centuries earlier in the Mogollon and the Hohokam. The Mogollon was probably the least well-developed of the 3 major complexes of southwestern cultures. They lived in pit houses. They practiced a good deal of gathering as well as being farmers. And the culture sort of disappeared around 1000 AD when some of our Anasazi from up here moved down and sort of overran, at least culturally overran, those Mogollon people. The Hohokam, on the other hand, in southern Arizona, were able to live there because they were irrigators. They practiced irrigation farming, and they captured the waters of the Gila and the salt rivers and the tributaries of those rivers, and by means of miles and miles of canals, irrigated that fertile desert land. Now, our folks up here, the Anasazi, were slow to get some of those Mexican elements because they had to filter up through those folks down below them. But once the Mexican elements reached up here, first of all, it was corn, and squash and beans, and finally pottery, and then elements of economic systems, elements of social organization, and then we certainly feel some ceremonial activities were occurring. Anasazi archaeology has undergone a century of research. We have divided up the Anasazi culture into a series of evolutionary time scale periods that begin with the early development, early settled life, when man lived in simple pit houses around the time of Christ. And we follow that sequence up from those early periods through time. We see villages emerging out onto the surface. The pit house is given up as a dwelling, retained as a ceremonial room. We begin to get little villages showing up, first of posts and mud, called Hakal, J-A-C-A-L, Hakal. And then those little villages turn to the use of stone masonry, simple little stone walls. And Mesa Verde has a lot of these here. And then finally we come to the period around 1200, when the large towns become the way of life of our Anasazi. And a territory that at one time had spread over most of the Four Corners and down to the Rio Grande in the east and over into the Hopi country to the west of us, began to shrink by the time of the 11 and 1200s. Larger towns, but not as many of them. And the population begins to concentrate. We see that very evident here in the Mesa Verde. And then around 1300, for some reason, the northern borders of the Anasazi territory saw a withdrawal of habitation. And our people who lived here began to move farther to the south, to the Rio Grande, to the Hopi country, to Zuni, and to continue to live there until the Spanish arrived. As interesting as the archaeological story is here in Mesa Verde, the story of the Anasazi, there's another intriguing one, and that has to do with the discovery, the explorations, and the history of Mesa Verde. It begins back in the 1700s, when two Spanish parties came through this part of the country, southwestern Colorado, and wrote diaries about what they encountered as they crossed this rather barren country. The first party was in 1765, when a Spaniard by the name of Rivera, coming from Santa Fe, moved into the La Plata Mountains over there, looking for minerals. And his diary mentions that in this country there were a number of ruins. He didn't know what they were, but they were ruins. We get an inkling of the antiquities here from this 1765 account. Escalante and Dominguez passed near the Mesa Verde, and they too recorded the abundance of ruins in this area, small ruins. In the 1870s, following the Civil War, a number of people moved from the Midwest into southwestern Colorado, and a mining boom took place. Along with the mining activities came government survey parties to learn more about the minerals that might be in this area. And the first person to actually take a picture of a Mesa Verde cliff dwelling was a member of the Hayden Survey Party in 1874. This was a photographer by the name of William H. Jackson, who later on became known as the pioneer photographer of the West. But in the 74, with the help of a miner from a nearby camp, he traveled south of the Mesa Verde proper through Mancos Canyon. And in so doing, encountered a cliff dwelling. He took a photograph of it, and he named it Two-Story Cliff House. A year later, a second government survey party moved through this territory, and a scientist with that party named William H. Holmes traveled through Mancos Canyon once more, re-examined two-story cliff house, and found several other cliff dwellings on the very southern border of the Mesa Verde. Decade of the 1880s saw a real turning point in the history of Mesa Verde archaeology. First of all, a young lady, a newspaper correspondent by the name of Virginia Donahue, who later became Virginia McClurg, arrived in this region to write articles about the antiquities and to visit the Indians. And in 1886, she visited one of the cliff dwellings that's become very famous here in the Mesa Verde, Balcony House. But really, in the 1880s, the discovery of the major cliff dwellings is built around a family that settled down the valley, just to the east of the Mesa Verde in the Mancos Valley. On December the 18th of 1888, the Wetherells discovered the largest of the cliff dwellings, Cliff Palace, and two other major cliff dwellings, Spruce Tree House and Square Tower House. And within a couple of years had also found practically all of the large cliff dwellings, named them, and removed collections from them. Many visitors came to the Wetherells, seeking their aid to examine the cliff dwellings, so a regular tourism business was started by the Wetherell boys, especially Richard, Al, and John, the three oldest brothers. And visitors would come from far and wide and be taken back into the canyons on pack trips to examine the cliff dwellings, and if they wanted, to dig in the cliff dwellings. Up to that point, the Wetherells were what we might call pot hunters. They were simply taking out materials for sale, and like many other people. But all that changed in 1891 when a visitor by the name of Gustav Nordenskjöld, a young Swede, arrived here. He was a scientist, and when he dug in the Mesa Verde in 1891, he applied principles of scientific investigations. He took many photographs, he made drawings, and in essence did a real scientific job. When he was ready to leave and return to Sweden, he packed up his large collection and shipped it to Stockholm, from where it was eventually moved to Helsinki, where it is in the National Museum of Finland today. From that time on, the Wetherells, following the practices of Nordenskjöld, did a scientific job of digging. Systematic archaeology was born at that time here in the Southwest. In 1906, a national park was established here in the Mesa Verde. Thereafter, for the next several years, an inventory was made of the ruins here in the park. And an archaeologist from the Smithsonian Institution in Washington was sent here to evaluate the material to help open up the park so that the visitors could properly see the antiquities of this area. The gentleman was Jesse Walter Fuchs. In 1920, and for a decade thereafter, the park really prospered under the tutelage, the guidance of the first archaeological superintendent to be appointed for Mesa Verde, Jesse L. Nussbaum. The University of Colorado did a lot of work here, beginning in the 50s and continuing into the 70s. The largest, most comprehensive program. It involved archaeology and environment and trying to interpret the material in relation to what was found around the Mesa Verde, was initiated in 1958. It was known as the Wetherell Mesa Project, and it was sponsored by the National Park Service as well as the National Geographic Society. My old-time friend, Alden Hayes, was a member of the Wetherell Mesa program from beginning to end. Let him tell you something about it.
Well, the Wetherell Mesa Project was a National Park Service sponsored archaeological project to help learn more about Mesa Verde archaeology, and also to enhance the exhibits in place that were already at Mesa Verde for people to see. And Douglas Osborne was the supervisory archaeologist, And it was Doug who actually built the project up and formed it. It was the most interdisciplinary project in archaeology that had ever taken place in North America. It involved as many as 150 other people other than those actually performing routine archaeological functions. All of the artifacts, it's all right up there at Mesa Verde right now in the research center on the park, every bit of it.
I'm kneeling in a pit house, one of several that existed in this area, forming a little hamlet. And this would have been the dwelling for a family, and there have been other families nearby. But this is the earliest kind of habitation the people of Mesa Verde lived in. They were dug down into the ground using a wooden digging stick. And in this particular one, which dates in the late 500s, we have an antechamber where I am now, and the passageway into the main part of the dwelling, which we will see in a moment. The antechamber served as a storage unit and also perhaps as an entrance. One came from the antechamber through this passageway behind me into the main part of the dwelling. Some of the features that are commonly present in these pit houses, which, as I say, belong to the hamlet stage of existence, or some people call them the modified basket maker period. The features that you would expect to see would be, first of all, plaster on the wall. This structure simply cut down into the ground, a hole. The walls would be fairly soft. To make them a better place to live, a mud plaster was put on to smooth it out and make them a little more refined. There are 4 post holes. I see one there. There's one beside me here, another over in that corner, and a 4th in that position. Each of these post holes was a place where a large, tall timber was embedded. On the top of those 4 posts, there were horizontal stringers put across. And that then formed a framework upon which smaller poles embedded along the side of the pit were leaned onto that framework at the top. And then the framework was covered by horizontal members, leaving an opening in the top to serve as a smoke hole. This superstructure then would be covered by interlacing small pieces of wood, vine, bark, matting around the wooden superstructure, and then finally covering it with mud. Notice that in this part of the house, we have a metate, a grindstone. Notice also there's a bit of a wall here that goes from this wall, probably stood this high, came across here to the fire pit, and a comparable little wall, a wing wall as we might call it, over here. We believe, because we quite frequently find in this section of a pit house a metate, manos, and things indicating food preparation. Maybe this was the area in which culinary pursuits were followed. In many of these pit houses, between the rear wall and the fire pit, there is a hole in the floor called a sipapu. Family rites, ceremonies, rituals around that. The prayers go down to the spirit world. We will see sipapu in the next pit house we look at. We've now moved from the earliest pit house, which we saw a while ago, to the next stage in the development of the Mesa Verde dwelling. And here we have what appears to be a pit house, very much like the one we saw at the last viewing. But this is not the same thing. This is actually two pit houses here instead of one. Pit house number one over here was built in the late 600s, lived in for a while, burned, and was abandoned, and became a ruin, was filled in here. At a later time, perhaps 15 or 20 years later, another group of people came in and decided to put a pit house right in here. It was so close to the first one that it actually impacted upon it and cut into it. And they had to put a stone wall here to hold in the loose fill of pit house number one. So we have pit house one and pit house two within a short frame of time, occupied almost contemporaneously. We see the same features that we saw in the first pit house with some additions. We see the 4 post holes that we saw previously. We see a fire pit in the bottom of the structure. We see wing walls extending from the wall on either side out to the fire pit. And note also there is a metate in almost the identical position it was in the first pit house. So we assume then this is a culinary area, the cooking area. That is where the other activities took place, out in there. And I promised you a sipapu. Here we have a sipapu. Do you see the little hole over there in the line between the deflector, the fire pit, and the wall? There's a little hole about that big around. That is the mythical entrance to the underworld where the spirits live. And if this family living in here performed certain rites, their voices reach the spirits down below through that little entrance. So we have here a house that was used for domestic purposes and also for family rituals. And if you look over here to the second pit house, you'll see the same features repeated. The 4 post holes. A bench around the wall has developed here. And you see it in both of these, the bench. In this second stage of the pit house, we see a rather marked addition, a change from the old pattern. Instead of having an antechamber through which air could enter and then come into the main pit house, we have a ventilator shaft. And if you look at that stone circle there, realize that lines a vertical shaft that goes down and connects with a horizontal tunnel that comes into the deep pit house in that position right there. That would allow air to come in when a fire was built here and create a circulation. And to keep the air from blowing directly onto the fire, a slab of stone, a deflector, was set up to the entrance of the pit house proper. This is a very complex site. It contains 3 structures built one on top of another. This illustrates all of the structures. This is the first that archaeologists have defined to have existed here, and it dates somewhere in the 900s. A little later, the structure, the first structure was abandoned. A second little village was built here of stone. And then finally, after the abandonment of the second village, a third structure was created, and that is the one that is on top of the first 2 ruins. Our Anasazi people, including those who lived in the Mesa Verde, lived in pit houses for several centuries. And then beginning in the 700s and 800s, they began to move their dwellings from beneath the ground up onto the surface of the ground. And in this particular site, where I'm crouched, we can exemplify this early kind of surface dwelling built by the people of Mesa Verde. And these structures become large enough so we could call this life village life. In this particular village, we can illustrate this first type of surface dwelling and also see some later structures. But this first village, which we saw on the exhibit chart, was an L-shaped structure of a number of rooms, built, in this case, of posts such as these that would extend up to the height of the ceiling of such a structure, and a flat roof on that. And then between these posts, they would lay smaller poles and put brush in there, and then cover the entire thing on either side with mud. This is a sort of structure called hakao. So it's not unusual to find one site having been developed, a village, abandoned, another village at a later time added, and in this case, 3 villages were built one on top of another. The first one we have described, the hakao. Over here, you can see the corner of a small community 100 years later, dating perhaps in the 900s, wherein stone masonry was substituted for the hakao, the posts and mud. And this stone masonry was a rather simple form of masonry. It's the beginning of the use of stone in building. And you see it's only a single course in width, a single stone in width. And it wasn't a very satisfactory form of building, but nevertheless, it probably offered more stability than did the old post and mud sort of thing. So we go from here to here, and we have a house and a kiva nearby. And then finally, in the late 1000s, our Mesa Verde people had achieved thick masonry walls using a number of stones set side by side to make a course, and building them up quite high. And in the background over here, and over in this direction, you can see parts of a wall of a village that was built of this wide coursed masonry. And there are several towers, which you may have noticed in the chart, the map of this village, incorporated into the community. The towers seem to be, in some cases, directly connected by tunnels to kivas. The third village at this particular site, the one with the thick walls and the towers, has an excellent example of a kiva of this period, around 1075, as I said. And if you look down here, you can see that this kiva is dug quite deeply into the soil, indicating again the depth of the soil here, and that it's an unusually large kiva. Further, it could be noted that it is a fairly early example of a complete kiva because the stone lining that lines the wall above the bench does not go completely to the surface. In the far view area, there are a number of small villages and small towns bridging that gap between the village and the town, such as this one. We call this Coyote House. It's not far from the main community of Farview, but actually was built probably in the 1050s and lived in for some time prior to the building of the Farview House, the large town. People ask quite frequently, how do you know there's a ruin here? And I happen to have dug this ruin, and let me tell you how we found it and why we dug here. First of all, when this was abandoned in the 1100s, it fell into ruin, and the stone walls collapsed and built up a mound. So first of all, there was a mound that stood up above the general level of the mesa top. And then to the south of the mound, where the people had dumped their trash, the soil was enriched by ashes and the like, and a large stand of sage, unusually large sage, grew in that trace deposit. So we have the trace deposit indicating a community by its vegetation, a rubble-covered mound representing the residue of the old community. And furthermore, things like these two items indicate an occupation area here. First of all, part of this community burned, and the tan sandstone was reddened by the heat. And so over a site like this, you frequently find very red pieces of sandstone that have been colored by heat from fires. And also, about a community like this, we find many potsherds, broken pieces of pottery, the everyday cooking and eating ware of the people, which apparently they broke in great quantities, and once a pot breaks into potsherds, as we call these broken pieces, they're practically indestructible. So we find them all over the ground around the site like Coyote House here. This was a village of a number of rooms and several kivas, Several things we don't quite understand. Why aren't these rooms finished? Were they niches for storing things? We don't know. But there are a lot of living units and the ceremonial kivas in this site. An unusual feature of this kiva behind me are the horizontal poles that extend from one pilaster or column to another. We found decayed poles in the places where these replacements have been positioned. I'm standing here in the front of Farview House, one of the large towns on the mesa tops here in Mesa Verde. It gives its name to this area of the mesa. Dr. Fuchs came here in 1916 and excavated the first of the mesa top sites to be opened up. But in this vicinity, there are approximately 50 ruins of various ages and sizes, representing the sequence from the early mesa top villages after people moved out of the pit houses and began to live in jacal structures, those post and mud villages, and then later the simple stone villages. And then later on, as culture evolved here, we find these towns like Farview House coming into the picture. This is an important area for a rather dense population on the mesa top. And it was made possible in part and at a certain time by the fact that the Mesa Verdeans built a water control system. And Mummy Lake was a reservoir. Water was funneled in there and kept. There was no outlet to the reservoir, which makes us think that it was probably used for domestic purposes, for drinking water. Mummy Lake was noted by the cowboys back around the turn of the century as a place that collected water. This structure is an unusual feature of the Mesa Verde people, one that we don't understand. Dr. Fuchs, excavating here in 1915, called it a sun temple, felt that ceremonies might have been conducted here, ceremonies involving the sun, but we really don't know, we're not sure. It is a planned structure. It appears to have not been lived in. There's even the question of whether it ever had roofs over these rooms or kivas. Sun Temple gets its name from this rock that protrudes from the corner of the structure that has this natural phenomenon in that looks sort of like a sun. And hence the name Sun Temple, taken from this feature. It is set on top of the mesa, surrounded by a lot of dwellings, towns actually. Cliff Palace is the largest of the cliff dwellings in the Mesa Verde. It is an immense structure. We call it a town. The cave in which it is situated, and it really isn't a cave, it's a rock shelter, it's a shallow cave. But it extends from one end to the other almost the length of a modern football field, and is about 100 feet deep and 60 feet high. And within that irregular shelter, 217 rooms and 23 of the ceremonial chambers were cramped. And there's a pattern, if you look at the map and examine this thing carefully, of a kiva being surrounded by a series of rooms. Up on that ledge, the people who lived here built a series of granaries, storage chambers. This area is an arid area today, and people wonder, where did the folks who lived here in Cliff Palace get their water? Water for drinking, water for cooking, water for making mortar and setting up the walls of their houses. And as far as we know, most of the water came from seeps that occur around the cliff edges and in springs that exist here. Using water locally obtained, mud which served as mortar from local sources, and stone from the top. Putting those together, they were able to produce the beautiful buildings that we see here. Bear in mind that the beautiful masonry that attracts us now was probably all hidden when the people lived here by a mud plaster. This is a very well preserved kiva that I'm standing in here. It is one that is typical of this period, the 1200s. It has the features that the kivas built in the large towns routinely possess. It has a mud floor. It has a bench or banquette that comes up to here, and it's plastered. And if you'll notice, look carefully, you'll see that there are many layers of plaster here. Perched on the banquette, a series of columns called pilasters, which were used to support a flat roof that went across the top of this. And actually, this roof was used then as a working place or a living place for the people who lived around here. In the floor, there are several features that are common again in kivas. There's a fire pit over here, and down in here is this little hole called the sipapu. This is a circular tower, the only one in Cliff Palace. It's not unique to Mesa Verde, but this particular one is very interesting in that it shows an excellence of construction. The stonemasons who designed and built this tower even curved the stones. Rather than using rectangular blocks, they curved each block to follow the circumference of the tower itself. This square tower, when it was found, was in very bad state of repair. And in order to protect the structure, it had to be stabilized. And furthermore, inside the structure, up in there, there's some original plaster with designs on it. And by stabilizing this corner, you also protected the work of art. So in 1909, Dr. Fuchs, who spent a number of years here in the park doing archaeology and preservation work, came into Cliff Palace and found the tower here to be in this condition. During the summer of 1909, he repaired this corner. And this is the way it looked following that repair. But through the years, after the repair, it was found that he hadn't done a very good job, and it began to deteriorate. So in 1934, an archaeologist by the name of Earl Morris was engaged to come back and to redo this corner. He removed all of the repairs that Fuchs had put in 1909 and relaid the stone in this corner, and that's what we're looking at today, the work that was done in 1934. This doorway leads into one of the lower story rooms of this tower. It was 4 stories in its entirety. And one of the reasons for preserving it was the fact, as I've pointed out, that there's a plastered room up on about the 3rd level. Entrance into Cliff Palace and out of Cliff Palace was by means of hand and toe holds. This is Spruce Tree House, the 3rd largest of the cliff dwellings in Mesa Verde National Park. It has about 114 rooms and 8 kivas. And I've just come out of one of those kivas. This kiva has been re-roofed by the Park Service, but it illustrates how this little patio or plaza area looked 700 years ago when the Indians were living here. You'll notice there are a number of rooms opening on to this courtyard. And the people who lived in these rooms probably used the top of this kiva and this small area as a place for everyday activities. During a ceremonial time, it was probably used for dancing. The participants would go down into the kiva and have their private secret ceremony down inside, then emerge, as I just did, fully garbed in costume, and perform a dance in here. This is the other side of the courtyard with the 2nd kiva. Again, this is a kiva whose roof has been restored to give you the impression of how this looked 700 years ago. The dates of Spruce Tree House, incidentally, are in the 1200s. And all of the cliff dwellings were built and lived in and abandoned in about a 75-year span of time. Note the two kinds of doorways used in the cliff dwellings. You see some are rectangular and others are T-shaped. Notice also at ground level over here, the slab of stone that sits beside the doorway. That slab of stone is the same size as that doorway and was placed in it in order to close it. There is a little bit of a balcony left, and it wasn't unusual to find balconies built out in front of these rooms, especially the second and third story rooms. It became a little workplace. Standing toward the rear of Spruce Tree House, we see that there are passageways that go from one unit to another, lead to the back of the cave. These are little streets, passages, through which people walked. They probably deposited a lot of trash in the back of that cave, as well as out in the front of the cave. And the turkeys probably scratched in that trash. In fact, they may have pinned up the turkeys in some of these little passageways to keep them away from the predators at night. These people had two domesticated animals. One was the turkey, the other was the dog. And the turkey provided them a great deal of materials for blankets in the form of feathers. The dog was a valued possession to an Anasazi family. Helped with a hunt. He was a sentinel. He was a pet. Their value is shown sometimes by the fact that they were even buried with burial offerings to show how highly they prized a dog. By 1300, the towns in the cliffs were silent, and the Anasazi had moved to the south. Why? A variety of reasons. Drought, overutilization of limited resources, internal squabbling, and a breakdown in religious and social systems.
Visitors to Mesa Verde today are impressed. There's scenery here too. From the moment they enter the park and ascend the north escarpment near Point Lookout, they build a feeling of excitement of the early explorers. The mesa is actually an erosional remnant tilting 13 degrees to the southwest. The road enters the park at 6,969-foot elevation and rises to more than 8,200 feet. Then slopes slowly to less than the entrance level. A quick stop at the Farview Visitor Center provides a list of options to help the visitors plan their visit. The summer season has the most activities. Let's examine them. Everyone should visit the Chapin Mesa Museum, 5 miles further down the mesa, for the best orientation to antiquities. A paved road, a half a mile north of the museum with 2 one-way 6-mile loops, allows the visitor to progress chronologically from early to late occupations through 10 excavated sites. Several overlooks afford views of rugged canyons and most outstanding cliff structures for which the park is best known. Travel the right-hand loop of the Ruins Road first. Here you will see first the Hamlet Stage Pit House. Then a good view of 700-foot deep Navajo Canyon with many small cliff dwellings. A few hundred feet farther is a short trail leading to the Square Tower House Overlook, where you see what remains of a 13th century 80-room structure that rose to 4 stories against a supporting cliff wall. Driving further along this road, you arrive at more surface ruins dating AD 675 to 1200. Understanding these developments is an important link in the story. Soon you arrive at Sun Point. This is one of the most impressive observation places in the park. About 100 feet below the mesa crust is a concentration of 13th century cliff dwellings, including Mesa Verde's centerpiece, Cliff Palace. On a mesa top to the left is the unique Sun Temple. The last site on this road is Sun Temple. Another great view of Cliff Palace can be enjoyed from here. The left-hand loop of the Ruins Road runs along the top arm of Chapin Mesa, separated by Cliff and Soda Canyons. A 10-minute drive brings park visitors to the spectacle most come to see, the awe-inspiring Cliff Palace. Access to the dwelling today involves a steep, winding path and 4 10-foot ladders, which were not available to the ancients. A second ruin on this road to be visited is Balcony House, the first of the major lost cities of the Mesa Verde to be rediscovered by Americans. It is a rare experience for visitors. Out of view, it sits in a high cave on the east side of this projection of Chapin Mesa, facing Soda Canyon. Here, modern viewers will have a taste of Anasazi cliffside stamina and daring, even though the hand and toe holds of the Mesa Verdeans have been replaced with a 32-foot ladder to reach the house, and a return crawl hole and strenuous but safe climb back up the cliff. This is no place for the faint of heart, but those who make the effort by joining the ranger-guided tour will be amply rewarded. Beyond the museum and down a steep trail past the canyon head in spring is a well-preserved spruce tree house. It is the 3rd largest ruin in the cliffs. The Farview cluster of villages lies about a mile south of the visitor center named for it. Best illustrating the late Pueblo-housed, agriculturally based Mesa Verde occupation, the 6 sites open for viewing are east of the road down Chapin Mesa. Farview House is the largest structure. This building dates from AD 1100 to 1300. To the south is the smaller enclosed Pipe Shrine House. Farview Tower, northwest of the large house, is a 2-story tower with 16 adjacent rooms and 2 kivas. Still farther northward is Megalithic House, a complex of 7 rooms and a kiva. A 5th village, now called Coyote House, to the south of the entrance road was another compact rectangular unit of 34 double-coursed rooms, 4 kivas, and a tower. A 12-mile scenic drive takes off near Farview Visitor Center for the western plateaus of the park. It's a scenic route with turnouts where one can view the Montezuma Valley. Step House is reached on foot from the parking area at the end of the Wetherill Mesa entrance road. The Step House Cave contains ruins of both the earliest and latest Mesa Verde habitations, separated by 600 years. Ruins on lower Wetherill Mesa are reached by a free mini-train departing from the parking lot at brief intervals. Stop 1 is for the ranger-guided tour of Longhouse. Stop 2 is for the Badger House community sequence of Mesa Top sites and spans the total Anasazi occupation of the Mesa Verde. At Stop 3, 2 Raven House, reached by a self-guided trail, is a small masonry-walled settlement built over the remains of an earlier pole brush mud structure. The next mini-train stop is for an overlook to Kodak House, a 60-room unit where Nordenskjöld hid his camera when not being used. Further along the trail, the mini-train stops at the best overlook for Longhouse. Both offer excellent photographic opportunities. Because of the fragile nature of the antiquities in Mesa Verde National Park, hiking is restricted. The most popular trail is the Petroglyph Point Trail. It is 2.8 miles in length and takes off from the Spruce Tree House Trail to the east of the museum. A panel of petroglyphs is visible on a cliff face just before the trail ascends. The trail returns along the mesa top to the parking area near headquarters. Robert Ellis summed it up. In these mesa top ruins, the walls have been strengthened with concrete. Here on these stone walls, America's ancient past and her spirited future come together. This is just as it should be.